Greetings, hello, and a very, very warm welcome to everybody who has logged in today, as well as friends and well-wishers who are joining in from far, far away. For some people, it is a bit late in the evening, and for some, it is a bit too early in the morning as well. So a very warm welcome to people across different time zones. I'm starting off and saying a big hi to everybody who's logged in a minute or a few minutes before. If I could get a quick chat message back, everybody can hear me loud and clear. I hope so. And we're going to start today's session. First and foremost, very important to tell everybody this webinar is getting recorded, and all the interactions that we will be having today, which is post-webinar, the question and answer sessions will also be recorded. There is unfortunately no registration that I have done with CPD or any organization yet who gives CPD without charging money from us. So if there is anybody you know who would be happy to do that, please share contacts. But to answer the anonymous question from an attendee, there is no CPD for today's session. We have a question and answer box as well as a chat box. Please familiarize yourself with the controls. You would see controls in your Zoom meeting link somewhere at the below. So if you are not familiar with it, please look around and find those. There will be discussions that can be done on the chat. Other people can also probably pitch in when you write to anything in the chat. The questions and answers session or the question and answer block is where I would be taking the questions and answering them, and not necessary that the questions written in the chat box could be captured. There are opinion polls or polls that will be as part of today's session. So wherever you see this icon blinking, please be ready to answer the quick poll questions that I will be opening. I think there are probably just 2 or 3 polls, but it gives a very good sense to me as someone who is presenting of what the audience thinks. So before I start today's, I must add a small disclaimer as well. I will be talking about codes as well as implementation of the codes. And there exists the possibility that some regulations, requirements have either changed or evolved, or maybe my understanding of the regulation published by a certain government entity is not very accurate. So I'm giving a disclaimer in advance. Many of you know me well or know me fair amount. My name is Abhishek Chabra. I am the person who has been sending out the emails to you, or at least from my name, and you've been seeing me. I have explored lots of things in the past 2 decades in my life across many industries. I'm an engineer and PhD in finance and worked in many sectors, in many places, and I found all of that very exciting. In the last decade and a half, I have been developing a big passion for the conformity industry and have my involvement in many aspects of the conformity industry, right from standard development organizations or SDOs like ASTM's UAE chapter, as well as ASTM E5 committee. I'm also involved in many ways with the accreditation bodies. I am on the technical advisory council of IAS for the laboratories, have been involved with the UAE Fire and Life Safety Code, as well as standard development processes in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for SASO. I have a blog group on LinkedIn called Gurus of TIC, or Gurus of Testing, Inspection, and Certification. It is something that keeps me busy when I am not working. For all of you who may not know us as a company, I work for a company called Bell-Wright International Consultants. We've been around since more than 25 years. 25 years ago, we started off as a curtain wall test laboratory and a facade consulting practice, as in the subcontractors, building envelope subcontractors would come and build mock-ups, and we would test them for air, water, leakage, etc. We continue to do so as well. A little over a decade, we ventured into fire testing, very exciting work. Started off with a furnace to do fire resistance testing and some reaction to fire tests as per the ASTM E84 or the Steiner tunnel test. And over the last 7 odd years, we have had an extreme focus towards conformity of materials for cladding, for building envelope, interior finishing, as well as passive fire protection. And we have expanded heavily in the last 7 years. We currently have 4 fire resistance testing furnaces, including 2 large ones, 4 meters by 5 meters, horizontal and vertical, with load bearing capability. We are also probably the only lab in the world which can test to the NFPA 285, the ASTM 2307, the BS 8414. All of them are large scale fire tests or fire propagation tests to simulate, not simulate, but to validate the behavior of cladding systems the way they are implemented. So with that as a background, let me begin today's session. We continue our journey towards better understanding and comprehension of passive fire protection as well as conformity. And unlike the last 2 episodes where we were very focused and talking about specific test method groups, as well as materials, in today's session, we take a very bird's eye view, a broad view, to develop a very good understanding of how we ensure fire safety. And there is a very interesting link, often not well understood, between fire risks, codes, building codes that are published and as well as evolving, as well as conformity to codes and conformity to requirements set in place to minimize the risk of fire. So today's session, we will understand how all of these aspects are linked together, and we have a special focus on the building codes in UAE, as well as the building codes that are getting implemented in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So I thought to begin the discussion today, and because we have to talk about fire, I called upon Professor Dumbledore and to show everybody what a fire is. And I believe everybody who is attending and people who are not even attending know exactly what fire is, how fire happens, and what all fire is capable of doing in a good as well as a bad way. But this is not why we are here. We all know what fire is. And what we need to know is how to ensure that the fire does not happen. And there are uncountable number of documents as well as approaches written to explain, to understand how to assess a possibility of fire. And this is something which is almost, as I call it, first principle. It is the approach. We need to understand why or how a fire may happen in a certain circumstance, in a certain occupancy, in a type of construction. And there are lots and lots of reference documents across the world, from ISO to the American NFPA to the British standards and guides. And it is a sea in itself. But this is something that is not always possible. You cannot pick up any and every project that is going to get into construction and say, okay, can there be a fire? Let's look at all the things that may cause the fire. And to help hasten things is where the evolution of building codes have come to existence. What are building codes? This is good to know and understand that based on the learnings of fires, accidents, based on the learnings related to how the construction methodologies have been changing, how new materials have been evolving. Group of experts, specialists, people like you and me, uh, contributed to arriving at some baseline criterias, some basic concepts of how and what to do certain things to ensure that all the risks that we could imagine, all the unimaginable risks that led to accidents and we learned from them, do not happen. But it is also equally important to understand the origin of these building codes and how and where they came about to be. And the concepts of building codes is not new. A lot of listeners who are logged in from India would know that people in India go back to 6th century AD when documents were written and published as guidance documents on how to build certain structures like temples and many other structures. And these guideline documents, also called as the Vastu Shastras, are documents which defined the direction of sun, the wind, as well as many other aspects related to the magnetic field of the earth, water movement, and habits of people in that specific place or geography. And the reason I say this is because it is very important to understand that when a certain building code is written and when the building code evolves, what all influences the building code, the geography, the climate, as well as knowledge of the people within that area and their understanding of building construction, building materials that are available. There are lots of factors that all come in together to evolve a building code. The American Building Codes, the IBC from ICC, International Codes Council, or the NFPA codes, a lot of American origin codes have been adopted in many countries. And there is a very interesting reason that the spread and the geography and the climates that are available across United States are a lot. And the building codes which originated in the United States had to factor in and take care of all these possibilities which influence how construction and accidents can happen. In today's session, we will take a slightly closer look at the two codes that have been becoming more and more popular in this region, and so much so that the UAE Fire and Life Safety Code has been able to create some very interesting path-breaking expressions which are being lauded in the UK and many parts of the world, and I will come to that when we talk about this code. But as we begin, we must understand the origins of each code and how it has come to be. Who is the key stakeholder who has written the code? Who are the implementers of the code? As an example, people who are very familiar with the UAE Fire and Life Safety Code, there are many who are in the audience who know about this code. The UAE Fire and Life Safety Code has been written by UAE Civil Defense, which means that the authority having jurisdiction, the authority who is almost the first responder to the defense of the civilians, to defense to life and property, is the authority who has written this code and is also the implementer of this code. And as you go through the sections of this code, and people who are very familiar with this code can very well relate to the concept that and understand that this code originated in the UAE. And hence, there is a lot of importance given to aspects which are very local to the place, many aspects which are very critical related to oil and gas, marinas, etc. But a very important understanding is this. The country in its aim is a relatively smaller and a young country, which means that it wants to, as you know, from some of the recent monuments like the Museum of the Future, it wants to position itself as the center of where the future is arriving. Many people, as architects, as well as people close to the construction industry, know that a lot of new ideas, new construction methodologies, construction material have all come into the country to create some of the landmark infrastructures and icons that exist in the country in a very short span of time. So one of the reasons and one of the concepts behind the UAE Fire and Life Safety Code has been to be open towards all different types of standards as well as methodologies which have evolved in different parts of the world and adopt almost all or the best practices of these. And what happened when this is being done or was done is that there was very quickly an understanding that as a country, though UAE is young and evolving and may not be equal to a large evolved economy who has established organizations who are responsible for conformity assessments and several different government entities who take care of different aspects related to ensuring that the construction and the material coming into the country from various directions is exactly up to the mark. And hence, it was very good and very quick revision, which happened in the 2018 revision, something very different. The UAE Fire and Life Safety Code plugged in a possible gap that many countries are still struggling to find a way to close. They published a chapter called the Chapter 18 for the roles and responsibilities of stakeholders. People who follow various large tragedies or accidents that have happened, or people who have been involved in understanding accidents like the Grenfell investigation, which talks about the lack of the golden thread or what links each stakeholder with other. This is something that a lot of people have realized and understood that it exists as a big gap, that different stakeholders may be following all the requirements that they need to for themselves or for what the purpose is, but some aspects get missed out. The UAE Fire and Life Safety Code of Practice hence links all the different stakeholders, starting from the building owner, the contractor, the consultant, the developer, and so on and so forth. There are so many. Just give me a second. I need to figure out how to mute somebody who has unmuted themselves. This is unfair. Can I request the audience to please mute themselves if there is someone who has unmuted themselves by mistake? Thank you. So to give you an answer, all the different stakeholders need to be taken care of what their duties are, right up to the tenants that exist as a part of the construct and what their responsibilities are. Even though the current jurisdictions and the current government organizations may not have yet enacted laws and requirements that could punish somebody or potentially give out a fine for someone not complying to the code, but there exists a clear responsibility of what all needs to be done to ensure that the minimum set requirements are put in place. I want to open a quick poll question to everybody who is in the audience. I would request you to give answers to this poll question so that I understand what is the current comprehension of the subject of the audience. I hope the poll is open and I look forward to answers while I take a 5-second break. This is something that has been lauded a lot, that the roles and responsibilities as a chapter exists in the code, in the building code, in a country where there does not necessarily exist a very evolved infrastructure of the responsibilities and how the responsibilities of so many stakeholders can be closed down. So while I wait for you to close down and quickly give your answers, I'm going to give a background that next is something that we talk about, how the conformity to the code is established. And while the conformity to the code needs to be established at several different levels, the focus of today's discussion is specific to conformity of materials that ensure that fire safety is brought about in the construction, etc. I'm going to close the poll soon, but whoever is ready to answer, I'll still wait for the answers. So what the UAE building code or the fire and life safety code of practice did is that in the roles and responsibilities chapter, and even before the roles and responsibility chapter, every chapter has a list of test methods or standards that are defined as requirements for the conformity of building materials. And very unique as against any other building code, each test method that is referenced in the building code does not have an year of publication. This is again a very first time concept. The code expects the manufacturers and the industry to apply the latest published version of the code. And here, even though a lot of conundrum comes out and who is applicable, these conundrums are solved by the responsible stakeholders who are given the flexibility to take decisions on the fire safety and how each test method interlinks with the other. The product approval process, the product conformity process is detailed to a great extent within the building code. The table that you see on your screens is a table out from the ISO standard 17067, which defines various methodologies for certification bodies on how to construct and implement their certification programs. So not only the UAE Fire and Life Safety Code goes out of the way to call for mandatory certification and listing for each and every product that is to be used to bring about fire safety, it also details the kind of scheme, which means the certification needs to have a sampling before the test is to be done, and many other aspects related to certification and listing are defined within the building code. And after getting a certification and listing of the product or the material, the manufacturer or its representative or the trader has a certain route to get another level of approval from the AHJ themselves, which is the UAE Civil Defense, who will issue a product approval. This is very unique to the way the country is. And now let's move to Saudi Arabia. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has recently adopted the IBC codes to publish the Saudi Building Code. When I say IBC, I mean the International Building Code. And what I mean by adoption is that they have, with the right permissions, published various volumes of the IBC and published them as the Saudi Building Code. And this allows them to not only implement the code the way they want to, but it gives them the flexibility to localize these codes over a period of time, as well as add in what may be required to be added in for the country. What are these codes? What do these codes do, etc.? Let's look at what is the aim of these codes. The aim of these codes is to bring a cohesive approach to ensure that the vision of infrastructure growth is fulfilled effectively. And they, as a country, chose to take on a code which is already evolved to a certain level. People who are in the kingdom or people who have lived in the kingdom in the past would know that there was a time that there were two electrical supplies. So in a house, you would have a 110 volt line and a 220 volt line or 230 volt line. So in a country who has a past learning and experience of mixing different codes or different methodologies has taken the learning and decided to say, we will adopt a code which is all encompassing. And what the code is a publication of up to, if I'm not wrong, 10 or 12 different codes, starting from the general code, the concrete code, loading, masonry, the construction code, steel structures, soils and foundation, electrical code, and the list is a fairly comprehensive list. And if I'm not wrong, there are 10 or probably 12 different publications. And the aim is that all of these different publications, which are guiding on how to ensure fire safety, energy conservation for residential, commercial, etc., they all speak the same language. It is a large group of basic requirements that have come to be. And the key reason for such a broad structure to come from a single source is very, very beneficial as a large country where the implementers of the code will be spread across different government bodies. It is important to know that unlike UAE, the owner of the building code is the SBCNC, which is the Saudi Building Code National Committee. It is not any authority. There is a separate entity outside, which is kind of formed out of SASO, which is Saudi Arabia Standards Organization, who has been tasked to publish this code as well as maintain this code, which means in the years to come, this code can evolve and will evolve and localize. There are three key government entities who are responsible for implementing the building code. The first is MOMRA, or Ministry of Municipal Affairs, Municipal and Rural Affairs, which is like the municipality. They are the first entity among the three entities who are responsible. They are usually the prime stakeholders of any infrastructure, and they are implementers of the building code, all the building codes. The next is, of course, when it comes to fire safety, we have the General Directorate of Civil Defense, who is going to ensure that several aspects which are related to fire safety are brought about in the correct sense. There are responsibilities which are clearly defined of each government department of how they will be implementing the complete bouquet of codes. And the third is an authority which is not the electrical authority, but the Ministry of Energy, because we understand, and people know this fairly well, that there are many other means of energy generation, electricity generation that are coming to be and are coming to fore. And hence the Ministry of Energy is also one of the three key implementers of the wide spread of the building codes. Now that we understand that unlike UAE, the holder or the owner of the building codes is a separate entity, and the implementers are three separate ministries. Now, to understand how the conformity to the code will roll out in a very different stance, which is in Saudi Arabia. As we said, that the requirements are implemented by 3 separate government bodies. And these requirements are mostly to do with what needs to be done, how it needs to be done, where it needs to be done, etc., etc. There are already certain laws and decrees in place to implement and enforce the requirements written across these publications or building codes. And there will be many more decrees and regulations that will be published in the times to come to start enforcing and coming up with mechanisms, legal mechanisms, which define and explain how these will be implemented. A lot of these robust implementations will help the growth aims and targets of the Vision 2030, and various non-existent laws or laws that are very, very important will come into play in the times to come. Let me talk about the regulation bit. At this point of time, product conformity or material conformity is the responsibility of SASO, which is the authority and the body who is the standard writing body of the country. So the country's standard owner and the standard writer is SASO. People in the kingdom and many others would know already that there are several technical regulations or laws in place which prohibit the buying and selling of materials and products which are not complying to the technical regulations of Saudi Arabia. People who may not be familiar with these would very well know that if you buy milk or toys or certain electrical products or cars, there is a mandatory requirement of the GEAM mark or the SASO quality mark. And hence, as the country evolves, more and more standards are being published as local SASO standards to define the minimum requirements of products and materials to be bought or sold in the country. And what you see on your screen in the center are some of the several technical regulations or laws that are already enacted and in place. And what the technical regulations or laws means that the products which are listed in these technical regulations are controlled. There is either a mandatory or a voluntary conformity scheme that exists for all the technical regulations that have been currently published. Some of you may be familiar with the SQM or the SASO quality mark, which is mandatory for certain product types and voluntary at this stage for certain types of products. And the way the conformity is implemented in the country is that for certain product types where mandatory is, you need to have a product certificate of conformity. And in those cases where a product certificate of conformity does not exist, you can attain a shipment-based or per shipment certificate of conformity, which will allow you to export or import the product into the kingdom. There also exists other conformity mechanisms or third-party certification programs which are available to various members who need to use conformity mechanisms to ensure conformity of products and materials. I hope this gives you a good picture of how this is, and we will take, of course, some of the questions later. But now, as we understand risk assessment, which needs to be done or is done sometimes to ensure that fire does not happen, we understand how 2 countries have written and implemented some of the minimum requirements for building codes, as well as how these 2 countries have 2 very different mechanisms to validate and ensure conformity of products and materials that exists. So let's look at how the tools of testing and compliance and conformity assessment are implemented and what may be the current gaps and how these gaps are fulfilled. People are familiar with the fact that across the UAE Fire and Life Safety Code, there are an extremely large number of standards as well as product groups which are referenced. The number of standards in the UAE Fire and Life Safety Code also increase many fold, because unlike the Saudi building codes, who point to test methods from generally North America in certain ISO standards, the UAE Fire and Life Safety Code points to standards from many parts of the world. So you would see European norms, British standards, American standards, ISO standards, and so on and so forth. And as the product registration mechanisms or conformity assessment mechanisms still are evolving, there are many products which have different levels of conformity that are currently being implemented. People might be familiar that in the UAE, it is almost impossible to sell aluminum composite panel into a project in the UAE until or unless it has not only the compliance requirements as per the codes, but is also registered with the civil defense and has a product registration. The same goes for fire doors, and there are people who may argue that we could buy and sell fire doors and without necessarily getting the exact product approval for the exact doors which are being sold. But these conformity mechanisms are evolving and will eventually evolve. But still, there exists a lot of gap. As an example, flooring material, carpets, curtains, and there is an extremely long list of products and materials which may be still flying under the radar, if I can say, and the conformity requirements set in the code are not necessarily implemented. But bear in mind that the chapter 18 is a very strong one. The building owners, the contractors, the consultants, and several stakeholders across the process of building approval sign in saying that we are responsible for ensuring that the code is getting implemented, which means at any point of time, certain stakeholders can be taken to task and asked exact evidences of product conformity, which they may have some proof, they may not have some proof. And this is an area where conformity mechanisms of certification and listing from entities who are third-party certification bodies, one of the 50 labs that UAE recognizes, needs to be in place, and you know one of them very well. Moving on to the kingdom, the matter is uniquely different because the stakeholder of conformity is SASO, which sets the minimum mandatory technical regulations and implements them by using voluntary and involuntary mechanisms for conformity. But still, there exists an extremely wide gap. Not all the products and materials which are referenced in the various building codes have a published technical regulation. And there also exists a mismatch because several technical regulations have either been written in the past or have evolved from a different route. As an example, for aluminum composite panels or ACPs, SASO published a standard for defining what the requirements are, and the mandatory Saudi quality mark or conformity and the technical regulation points to this SASO standard. But if you need to comply to the requirements in the building code calls for an ASTM E84 very specific, NFPA 285 very specific, and it calls for conformity to specific standards. While it will take time and there is a lot of change which is in the making, but there currently does exist a fair amount of gap where responsible stakeholders like contractors, consultants, architects themselves need to take on the role and aspect of ensuring that conformity is validated throughout the course of process. Let me open a quick poll on the next slide for everybody to understand where the listeners are on this small aspect. Before I move to the last section of today's workshop, which is how do we really ensure the fire safety now that we understand what is the origins of fire safety, the first principle knowledge and understanding of risk assessment and why risk assessments are done, how conscientious professionals and experts like us or you and several others have written down minimum requirements that should be put in place to ensure that all the risks that we could imagine, we could see all the risks that we learned from past accidents around the world, how they can be minimized. All these requirements, though have been put in place in the building codes, the conformity mechanisms are different and there will always be a gap. So how do you as a stakeholder in the whole process ensure that fire safety is maintained? I will let the other listeners answer the questions while I take a small sip of water. I see the number of people rising who are answering the poll questions. Thank you very, very much. This is very, very helpful for me to understand that there are a fair number of developers and owners in the audience, even people from the insurance industries, and of course, designers, as well as people who are from the government. Very glad that all of you are here. Let's look at how this works. What is the problem? While everybody races the timeline of ensuring that the project is completed within time, within budget, there are some lags and leakages. At the outset, we need to start when we are designing to mitigate and ensure the provisions exist in the specifications, in the building code, in the contract, to make sure that all the foreseeable fire risks are taken care of. And the building codes are often the first starting point, but for several types of occupancies or several types of buildings and construction, which might be unique, which might be a first time, there needs to be an additional effort put in place to ensure that the right and the correct specifications and the compliance requirements are put in place. And while the construction is on, it is equally important that those correctly written requirements are being implemented correctly. Compliance to products and materials is being verified. Compliance to installation mechanisms is being verified, as well as there is a good and clear documentation, because once the building is handed over, once the construction is completed and people are gone, the FM companies need to come in, the people who need to use the building come in, and there needs to be a very good understanding of what the original idea was to ensure if such a fire happens, how it will be taken care of. And nobody really wants all those means and mechanisms to be thrown out of the building and the building attacked and eventually becomes a different kind of building. So what do we do to ensure that these things do not happen? We need to plug the goals. Correct specification of certification and listing as means of conformity needs to be in place. I have spoken in several technical sessions in the past. Many of these are now available on our YouTube page. If anybody in the audience is keen to understand how different conformity assessment mechanisms operate and how they can be validated, there is more information available. Also, it is important to understand that the project-specific risks for certain occupancies would require and may require for project-specific tests. We need to have well-trained or probably third-party inspectors who can distinguish and understand what is a qualified, certified, or compliant product or material. Is it being installed correctly or not? And of course, as mentioned, all of this needs to be documented well to preserve the course of all of this information, the strategies throughout the life cycle of the building. While I have in the past talked about how you can check and validate whether the products and materials that are reaching the sites are complying to or not, and how certification mechanisms, not just from Thomas Bell-Wright as a certification body, but several other third-party certification bodies who have created mechanisms for installers, inspectors, contractors to make sure that whatever material that was spec'd, whatever material was given in the project specification is exactly the same material that is reaching the site. It is exactly the same material, not just the same material, but even the installation and how the installation needs to be done as information is available and is valid. The same goes for a large variety of products and materials. Here is an example of aluminum composite panel. And on the image on the right, you can see that there exists a small ticker tape which lists down the certification number. And this certification number can be validated on the directory of the certification body. I must share an example. I think I touched about the ACP requirements, that the aluminum composite panel requirements in Saudi Arabia as the minimum technical regulation is different, and the requirements set in the building code are different. And hence it is very, very critical that whoever is taking on the liability of ensuring that the building, the construction that you're doing, the design, as well as the implementation, everything is complying to some of the minimum requirements that have been put in place. So as I end today's session, I feel that there is a lot of importance that we all need to pay to the specifications and contracts that are written in place. Thank you for today's session. I am now going to read through some of the questions that have been coming in, and anyone else who has queries towards today's session can please type in the questions in the question and answer slot that you would have. I hope the session was interesting and informative, and it has evoked some specific queries. Let me go back to listening to this. There is no attendance. I'm sorry for today's session. And of course, as always, you will all be getting a link to the recording of the webinar. In fact, we have changed the stance because a lot of people have not been able to get the emailers sent after the webinar. So anybody who is interested to listen to the recordings can head to Thomas Bell-Wright's YouTube page. We have uploaded all the past webinars of the first series, as well as this second series of webinars is available to be freely heard to listen to at a time that you would want to. And I would not be emailing these slides as the PDF. Okay, some questions are starting to come in. It's strange to get a question from an anonymous attendee. I would love to know the name of the anonymous attendees, but still let me answer. How does the Saudi building code requirements fit or coincides with the technical regulations for building materials? This is a good question. Thank you, anonymous, for asking this question. This is something that is getting filled in. It does not currently totally coincide because a large number of technical regulations in SASO were either initiated or published long before the process of adopting the Saudi building code was started. And hence, as I know, there are an extremely large number of people within the kingdom who are working very hard to try and come up with trying to bring them together. But the way I know it, it is something that will take some time. I would love to have your name who asked this question. Another question saying, could you please confirm whether all the buildings in KSA should compliance with respect to IBC US requirements or BS standards are also accepted? So Arun, the answer to your question is, the way I know, there is an implementation timeline that has been put in place by the Kingdom and the Saudi Building Code authorities, as well as there is an implementation process. All the information is available on the SPC website. I think my colleague put on the link in the chat as well in the past. Different types of buildings will have to come under the requirements of the Saudi Building Code, not the IBC US. And there may be slight deviations creeping in already. So I would recommend that you look into the Saudi Building Code, go to their website, and you can buy these codes straight away. And the different jurisdiction implementers, like the different government bodies, are going to ensure that this gets implemented. The way I know it from the SPC 801 and 201, which is the fire code and the general requirements, there are no British standards that are listed as requirements in the code. So any last questions? Any fire insulation criteria in high rise and exit door? Sorry, Manish, the question is not very clear, but I can take this question online. Any other question, guys, before I close today's session? I aim to finish the session in 45 minutes, 50 minutes. So I'm going to wait for a few minutes. If there are any other questions coming in, I think some of the questions are such that I will have to take them offline with each one of you. So I'm going to answer these questions separately. So today's session comes to a close. Thank you each one for attending today's session. I hope the session was interesting as well as informative, and some of the things that I was able to share are good and worthwhile. And I look forward to seeing you all again next month in the 4th episode. If you like the session, please feel free to give some feedback, write some comments, and of course, you can share the same as a webinar series that has been happening. Thank you very, very much for today, and goodbye for today's session. Thank you. I will be closing the session soon.